Good evening. My name is Audra McCowan, and I am a graduate candidate at Arkansas State University in the Master of Science Education program. This evening, we will be discussing psychoeducational testing for identification and placement. We will discuss a young lady that we will refer to as Patricia. Patricia is a sixth grade student who is 12 years old and attending a local middle school here in Memphis, Tennessee. Patricia's background history is, we'll go into it pretty brief. She lives with her mom and her two brothers. Her mom shared that many of her behavior problems began after her dad passed away. She was attending a private preschool and just began to shut down. So slowly she began to stop talking to adults. She would only talk to her peers. And over time, she began to respond to adults, but did not quite answer their questions correctly. So mom believed that she was just being stubborn. Um, the school referred her for psychoeducational testing to determine the possible presence of a disability. So we're going to review quite a bit of Patricia's data to make a determination from the data as to whether or not she has a disability, and if so, what disability she meets the criteria for. So the most recent testing was administered in 2015, and it was the Reynolds Intellectual Assessment Scales, which is also referred to as the RIAS, the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, which is referred to as the WIAT, the Vineland 2 Adaptive Behavior Scales. There's a survey interview form that was completed. The Adaptive Behavior Assessment System, the Teacher's Form. In 2013, the Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence, third edition, was administered. The Bracken School Readiness Assessment, third edition, was administered. The Beery Botanica Developmental Test of Visual and Motor Integration was administered. And the Vineland 2 Adaptive Behavior Scales, second edition, parent rating form was administered or filled out. And then the Vineland 2 Adaptive Behavior Scales, second edition, teacher rating form was completed. So let's talk about these particular exams. So the Reynolds Intellectual Scales, or the RIAS, was a test that was developed by Dr. Cecil Reynolds and Dr. Randy Campus. It is a paper and pencil form test, and it can be given to individuals between the ages of 3 and 94 years of age. It is pretty quick to administer. It takes about 20 to 25 minutes. And if you complete the additional memory assessment, you will add about 10 minutes to the testing time. There's a verbal intelligence index, a nonverbal intelligence index, and a combined intelligence index from both. This test tests working memory, short-term memory, learning, verbal domain, pictorial stimuli, ability to reason, problem solving, nonverbal intelligence, and just general intelligence. On the Reynolds Intellectual Assessment Scales, Patricia had a composite score of 40 for the Verbal Intelligence Index, which was a percentile rank of less than 1. On the Nonverbal Intelligence Index, she received a score of 55 and a percentile rank of about 1. And then the Composite Intelligence Index was a combined score, was also 40 with a percentile rank of less than 1. So composite scores that have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15, which means any scores that are 85 are one standard deviation away from the mean. Any scores lower than that are 2 standard deviations away from the mean. Patricia's scores were very low. She scored 40, 55, and 40, which means she was at least 2 standard deviations away from the mean. The Wechsler Individual Achievement Test 3 was also administered to Patricia. The WIAT is an individually administered exam. It's a nationally standardized test, and it's given to individuals between the ages of 4 and 50. It takes about 35 to 104 minutes to complete, just depending on the nature of the person who's testing. It is comprised of 7 composite scores and 16 subtests. The exam yields or gives standard scores, percentile ranks, grade equivalents, and stanines. Individuals who receive this exam are tested on oral language, total reading, basic reading, reading comprehension, fluency, written expression, math, and math fluency. The subsets that they are tested on is listening comprehension, oral expression, word reading, pseudo decoding, reading comprehension, oral reading fluency, alphabet writing fluency, spelling, sentence completion, essay composition, math problem solving, numerical operations, math fluency for addition, math fluency for subtraction, and math fluency for multiplication. So the Wechsler Individual Assessment Test 3, Patricia received scores for math calculation skills and math reasoning skills. Her math calculation skills were less than kindergarten, and her math reasoning skills were less than pre-kindergarten. Both of her percentile ranks were lower than 1%, and her standard score was 48 and 40. There was no grade equivalent, percentile, or standard score given for the basic reading skills or for the written expression, as at this time, Patricia cannot write, she cannot write her name, and she cannot read. She is still learning how to identify alphabets. Patricia was also given the Vineland 2 Adaptive Behavior Scales. The survey interview form was filled out. So the Vineland scales were developed by Sarah Sparrow, Dominic Cicchetti, and David A. Balla. This assessment measures everyday personal and social skills needed to function in everyday life. The test is broken up into 2 parts. There's a teacher rating, which is typically TRF, and it can be used for individuals aged 3 to 22. But there's also a parent rating that can be used for individuals birth to 90 years of age. There are 4 parts. So there's the teacher rating form, the parent or caregiver form, the survey interview form, and the expanded interview form. There's 4 domains with 10 subdomains and a maladaptive behavior scales. The scores yield standard scores, percentile ranks, adaptive levels, and age equivalents. The interviews can be administered in as short as 20 minutes, but can take as long as 60 minutes. The adaptive behavior portion measures communication, which includes receptive language, which is how we receive information, expressive language, which is how we give information, and then written communication, how we form words and write to communicate. The daily living skills measures personal, domestic, and community skills. So how we behave at home, how we behave outside of our home, as well as how we behave in the community. The socialization measures interpersonal relationships, play and leisure time, and then coping skills. How well do we cope when things go our way? How well do we cope when things do not go our way? Also, there's a motor skills component that measures fine and gross motor skills. And then finally, the maladaptive behavior index, which measures internalizing or externalizing problems. Do we hold things in? Do we act out? So in 2013, she was given the Vineland 2 Adaptive Behavior Skills, second edition, and the parent or caregiver completed the rating form. So for communication, the percentile rank was less than 1, and it was a standard score of 52. For daily living skills, the percentile rank was less than 1, and the standard score was 60. For socialization, the percentile rank was 1, and the standard score was 66. For motor skills, the percentile rank was 3, and the standard score was 72. For the adaptive behavior composite, the percentile rank was less than 1, and the standard score was 60. So again, standard scores have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. All of Patricia's scores were at least 2 standard deviations away from the mean, except for motor skills. For the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Skills, second edition, the teacher rating form for communication, it was less than 1. For daily living skills, it was less than 1 with a standard score of 46. For socialization, it was a percentile of less than 1 with a standard score of 55. For motor skills, it was a percentile of 1 with a standard score of 64. And then the adaptive behavior composite for the teacher rating form was less than 1 with a standard score of 51. In 2015, she was given the Vineland 2 Adaptive Behavior Scales, the survey interview form again. The communication percentile rank was still less than 1 with a standard score of 54. The daily living skills was 1 with a standard score of 62. The socialization percentile was 1 with a standard form score of 62. And motor skills were a percentile rank of less than 1 and a standard score of 51. The adaptive behavior composite was less than 1% and a standard score of 60. The adaptive behavior assessment teacher form for conceptual, it was a percentile of less than 1 with a standard score of 52. Social was a percentile of less than 1 with a standard score of 55. And practical was a percentile score less than 1 with a standard score of 57. And then the general adaptive composite was a percentile less than 1 with a standard score of 49. Patricia was given the Weschler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence, third edition, in her initial testing. So the Weschler Preschool and Primary Scale was also developed by Dr. David Weschler. It measures cognitive development for preschool and young children. The administration time is broken up into 2 parts. Children ages 2 to 3 test for 30 to 45 minutes. Children ages 4 to 7 are tested for 45 to 60 minutes. It yields 3 scores for a full scale, a primary index, and an ancillary index. There's a full scale and primary index scale measures for verbal communication, visual spatial, fluid reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. The ancillary index scales measures vocabulary, non-vocabulary, general ability, and cognitive proficiency. The scores help identify or qualify students with cognitive delay. It also evaluates cognitive delays, intellectual disabilities, autism, and giftedness. The scores can be used to help determine the extent of traumatic brain injury or cognitive functioning. The Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence scores for Patricia are as follows. For verbal, she had a composite score of 68 with a percentile rank of 2. For performance, she had a composite score of 68 with a percentile rank of 1. And then her full scale IQ was a composite score of 68 and a percentile rank of 2. So again, these scores have a standard, a mean of 100, and a standard deviation of 15. So any scores below 85 are at least one standard deviation away. Any scores 85 or below can be as far as or as much as 2 standard deviations away. All of Patricia's scores were 68, which means she was at least 1 to 1.5 standard deviations away from the mean, which equivalents to the scores are significantly low. Her information subset had a scale score of 2 and a percentile less than 1. Her vocabulary had a scale score of 3 and a percentile rank of 1. Her word reasoning had a scale score of 3 and a percentile rank of 1. The performance of subset scores summary breaks down even more, where there's block design, picture concepts, and matrix reasoning. For block design, she had a scale score of 2 and a percentile rank of less than 1. She had picture concepts with a scale score of 2 and a percentile rank of less than 1. And then there was matrix reasoning, where she had a scale score of 5 and a percentile rank of 5. This appears to be Patricia's strength, but it's still very low. The processing speed subtest scores summary gives a score for coding of scale score 3, percentile rank 1. So with the scale scores, we have a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 3, which means one standard deviation away would be any score near or at 7. Anything lower than 7 means that you're 1.5 to 2 standard deviations away from the mean. All of Patricia's scores, except for matrix reasoning, which was 5, was either 2 or 3, which means she was at least 2 standard deviations away from the mean. Patricia was also given the Bracken School Readiness, 3rd edition. It was developed by Dr. Bruce Bracken in 2007. It helps to determine if a child is ready to go to school, or as we like to say, school readiness. The assessment is for children 3 to 6 years of age. There is no set time limit, but you can administer it in as short as 10 to 15 minutes. The 5 areas that are addressed during the testing include colors, letters, numbers and counting, size comparison, and shapes. There are no varying levels to the test. Children are awarded scores by the number of correct answers. The assessment is also used to determine deficits. It's linked to state standards for early childhood and to IDEA, No Child Left Behind Act. The assessment is also used to determine deficits. It also determines if a child has a deficit in both receptive and expressive skills, or just in receptive skills only, or expressive skills only. Patricia's school readiness composite was a score of 61 with a percentile rank of 1. So the descriptive classification for her would have been very delayed. She was also given the Beery-Butenick Developmental Test of Visual Motor Integration. which was developed by Natasha Berry, Norman Bucktickney, and Keith E. Berry in 2010. It measures how well an individual can use their visual or motor ability together. It can be given to individuals 2 to 99 years of age. There are two forms that are broken up by age. The full form is for individuals between the ages of 8 and 99. The short form is for children ages 2 to 7. The assessment takes approximately 10 to 15 minutes to complete for each part, and it tests visual perception and motor coordination. The assessment is good for individuals possibly encountering visual and motor integration difficulties. It is also great for diverse backgrounds. The reason why: there's no bias for the environment, the education, or any linguistics backgrounds. It is culture-free and nonverbal. The assessment can be used for just one individual or for a group. Patricia's Berry VMI total was a standard score of 74 and a percentile of 4. All of Patricia's scores on all of her exams placed her either low or very low or at risk or clinically significant for every score that she received. So her school requested psychoeducational testing to investigate suspected developmental delays. The testing will help to determine current levels of functioning. So Patricia's reported delays were causing an adverse educational effect by limiting the rate at which she could acquire new skills and retain concepts. She also exhibited behaviors that could appear to be symptomatic or atypical of developmental delays. So a child must exhibit a significant delay, at least 2 standard deviations below the mean in one area, or 1.5 standard deviations below the mean in 2 areas. For all of the tests administered, Patricia was at least 1.5 to 2 standard deviations below the mean. Being this far below the mean causes an adverse effect on educational performance in order to meet the criteria. She met the criteria for a developmental delay in the state of Tennessee for her initial testing. She was tested in the areas of cognition, physical development, communication, social emotional development, and adaptive behavior. She met the standards for all 5 areas by being at least 1.5 to 2 standard deviations below the mean in all of her scores. And as a result, these data do meet the state of Tennessee's psychometric criteria for developmental delay and a language impairment. She was tested again 2 years later, and to this day, her current psychoeducational results reported significantly impaired intellectual performance. Her adaptive performance also indicated results in the very low range. Her scores are still more than 2 standard deviations, which suggests that she will experience extreme difficulties in the areas of communication, daily living skills, and socialization. To meet the criteria as having an intellectual disability, a student must meet these standards: be significantly impaired in intellectual functioning, which is 2 or more standard deviations below the mean; be significantly impaired in adaptive behavior in the home or community, as indicated by a composite score 2 or more standard deviations below the mean; be significantly impaired for adaptive behavior in the school, as determined by systematic documented observations; have delays in intellectual abilities, as indicated by the developmental history; and above characteristics cause Do the above characteristics cause an adverse effect on educational performance in the general education setting? Patricia scores in the very low range and being at least 1.5 to 2 standard deviations in all 5 areas means that she meet the criteria for an intellectual disability according to Tennessee state standards. She was initially DD, and that changed once she turned 7 and had more testing. Her testing then indicated that she had an intellectual disability, and all testing from the initial testing after preschool to now still indicates the same thing, that the student that we refer to as Patricia has an intellectual disability.